Heads up, this video will contain plot spoilers for the following to varying levels. The Forest, Sons of the Forest, the Predator movies, the first one primarily, I Am Legend, Primal, the TV series, mainly the first season, Water Womb World, REANIMAL, ULTRAKILL, Mystery Flesh Pit National Park, Cave Crawler, Gemini Home Entertainment, and the Russian Sleep Experiment. With that disclaimer out of the way, getting straight into the topic of the video, first off, what is Primordial Horror and why am I talking about it? Well, while Primordial Horror as a concept is not recognized as a true or even subgenre of horror writing, so much I don't think it even has a common recognizable name like Cosmic and or Eldritch Horror, it can currently at least best be described as a vibe, tone and or setting for a story. However, I see a lot of potential for it to be developed into a genre, which is why I'm talking about it today. Albeit, how do I go about even defining what this hypothetical primordial horror genre even is? What would even define something around this concept? That's a very good question. I'm going to do exactly that by discussing aspects from the list of games, movies, shows, series, etc. that appeared at the start, in whatever order I feel best gets my point across. And during that, I will try to build a list of things I feel add to the genre and enable a large palette of opportunity within it or around it. Now, to get this started. Starting this off with The Forest, a game released all the way back in 2014. To me, what makes this game fitting of the connection to Primordial Horror is frankly most of it. The game has you on a primarily wild island, possibly off the coast of Canada or something, fighting off cannibalistic feral human-looking but not truly human natives, alongside the horrific, mutated, almost eldritch mutant enemies that also reside on the island, such as the iconic Armsy and Virginia. The creatures you're fighting, while they look human, they completely lack humanity. They're barbaric, cannibalistic, violent, and naturally have an outright fear and or aggression towards you. The natives of this island are so detached from humanity as a concept, the very idea of speech, the one thing you could argue defines us from animals, is completely absent from them. Instead, they roar, scream, bellow, hiss, growl, acting like the animalistic beings they are. They are by no means unintelligent, evident by their tribal structures, some of which seem to be very carefully built. And it's also very clear from bifurcated corpses around the map that they have the intelligence to operate the chainsaw you can find within the game, showing highly advanced tool use. Regardless, the sounds these beasts make are even worse at night. A hunting party could spot you from a distance away and scream to alert its allies, and then begin moving towards you while you can't even see them. The deep primal fear of this gang of creatures stalking you in the night is visceral and primal, further tapping into that primordial theme. Albeit to not dive too deep, I'm going to keep the explanation of their nature simple here, as I have done videos on this game prior, covering the mutated cannibal natives of the islands from both games and the character Dr. Matthew Cross from the first game. If you want a deep lore dive into those two aspects, I'm going to link them in the top right corner and the description. Anyway, it's not just the enemies and setting that connects to Primordial Horror, it's how you play as well. You need to use natural resources to survive. You have to cut down trees, make fires and hunt food to survive while exploring the island. Functioning like a hunter-gathering caveman is an essential part of the gameplay until you establish an actual base and start farming, which you could say that somewhat detracts from the primordial theme, but whatever. Essentially, the forest drops you into a primal survival situation on a wild island, pitting against feral animalistic beings that superficially resemble humanity. The whole time, your instincts, humanity's hunter-gatherer nature, plays a role. And fear in a primal sense will be looming over every time you see a hunting party searching for you as they patrol the island. Especially early game when you're under-equipped, and late game when they start patrolling with multiple mutants. Or alternatively, your instinct to fight will kick in. You'll grab the best weapon you have, and start absolutely rocking their shit. Either kicking the utmost ass, or it turns out you fucked around a bit too hard and proceeded to find out. Regardless, summary of this, the forest's setting, enemies and gameplay all leans into a primal survivalist situation, which is a good framework for Primordial Horror to take place. And with that set up, now to move on to Sons of the Forest, the game's sequel. Sons of the Forest is a bit further removed from the primordial terror of the original game. You get guns in this game, albeit they are a later game item, and for the early game you'll be primarily relying on melee spears and arrows. On a related note, talking about the aforementioned spear, in both games, don't bother trying to use them to hunt. For some reason they're just ridiculously underpowered. You're better off making the bow and arrow for that. Anyway, regardless, moving on. Sons of the Forest also has an electrical system, further taking it away from the Primordial Horror roots that the first game had. Albeit this system is optional for base building, it isn't entirely reliable, it's just a thing you can do. But anyway, speaking of which, the base building system is also a lot more open. You can make custom bases by cutting logs and setting them up however you wish, which gives you, the player, significantly more freedom, yes. But does that really add to Primordial Horror theme? Not exactly, but also it doesn't really detract from it, I just think it's an okay addition. Anyway, outside of that, the plot itself of Sons of the Forest leans more into cosmic horror with the revelation of the Golden Cube, and also the crashed alien ship as well. This technically adds to it, but primarily takes away from the primordial idea. On one hand, it shows a powerful force is responsible for the creation of the mutants and cannibals, and we get some idea that it's alien civilization related. While on the other hand, it shows us that an alien civilization is responsible for all of this, including the first game, and not some enigmatic, implied to possibly be Satan, like the Red Man worship possibly being symbolic of this in the first game, or other evil and or eldritch or primordial force that the first game tried to imply, which greatly detracts from the primal horror idea. Instead, it's just ancient aliens the game, essentially. Honestly, I sort of really liked the idea of the first game, the Red Man and the Resurrection Obelisk, because it leaned into the idea of this obelisk, this structure being ancient and some ancient civilization using it. But now that you've thrown aliens into the mix, it just kind of spoils the whole ancient horror below the ground theme that the first game was working with. But despite how much Sons of the Forest steps away from the primordial horror, the first half of the game is still in touch with it. You're stuck on an island crafting to survive while hunted by wild cannibals and monsters. Some of the monster designs in the game I feel really add to the theme. Meanwhile, others feel just uninspired or really fucking silly. Like, one of them is just two guys who have been fused together at the legs, and they're referred to as the caterpillar, and it just kind of like somersaults towards you, and I cannot take its design seriously in the slightest. In fact, the only fear I really felt towards this thing, gameplay-wise, is just how much insane damage it does, and how much health it has. And just how bullshit it is gameplay-wise. Like, I remember, it turns out this thing could straight up clip through walls at one point. The devs had to fix it. Regardless, anyway, to not get too detracted from the core point here. Overall, having guns and electricity is not inherently anti-primordial horror. They can work in such a setting. But what really rips it away from it is the alien reveal. I feel if you want the actual primordial horror force to be something alien, it needs to be bigger, more eldritch, more akin to something H.P. Lovecraft would make. Not just some fuck-ass golden cube, which proceeds to hit the shuffle setting on the genetics of whatever poor bastard happens to be in range at the time it goes off on, which it seems to do at set intervals for some fucking reason. No, what you need is something more existential, something tied to the actual root of humanity as a species, as that would be more befitting given the nature of the enemies you're battling against. Like, imagine, if you will, instead of it being revealed that an alien artifact was responsible for these monsters, you have a giant biological mass deep below the Earth's surface of unknown size, reaching up towards this one specific island, an extension of that mass created humanity for whatever reason. This giant mass is an unknown, incomprehensibly large thing, and it does not resemble any known type of life. However, it is the origin point of humanity itself, and these creatures are what's left of the original starting point of humanity. That would make its existence have far more reaching implications, adding a sense of existential horror to the very nature of human existence. This thing would fundamentally be the primordial god of that setting. Best part is, you could do this using an alien too, if executed properly. The mass does not even need to originate from Earth, given this is just an example. It just needs to be on Earth to actually make humans in the first place. Hell, it could have been seeded by something even older, like the actual Big G god himself. I will elaborate a bit more on this idea later, but whatever. Anyway, what makes this mass idea, to me at least, better than the alien artifact? One, it'd be more fitting given the setting. And two, while the alien artifact gives us a solid idea of where it came from, it just kind of traps the direction of the story. Essentially either forcing you to leave the artifact unexplained or explore that civilization more and the implications around it, which in turn drags it further away from the primordial setting and more towards cosmic horror. However, that biomass is not restricted to this choice given the further reaching implication, meaning there is more room for what can be done here. If anything, it can be used to further explore the primordial setting in countless ways if you use your imagination. But ultimately, what does Sons of the Forest add to Primordial Horror? In summary, its gameplay is somewhat connected to it, and it could have been a good way to expand on it, albeit it fails to by going away from it instead of exploring it. Essentially, you need to make the most of Primordial Horror's setting and actually lean into it. You can have guns and electricity, but just don't get too separated from the terror of being hunted, or the existential horror it can be used to explore. Anyway, in relation to the aforementioned gun thing, we're going to be moving on. The Predator movies, primarily the first one. The setting of the first Predator movie really leans to the hunter versus hunted idea, and how humans can outsmart something stronger than us, and guns do play a role in a great way. Because while the Predator has superior technology, all of its actual ways of hunting are just a supercharged version of something we could use and make, albeit minus the shoulder cannon thing. Still, the main characters use simple, albeit effective methods to ultimately defeat the Predator. Muds to hide their body heat, traps, etc. Arnie ultimately getting the jump on the thing, which ultimately allows them to defeat the Predator, and us to see what it finally looks like, satisfying our innate desire to know what the monster is as we overcome it. Also, you've probably noticed each of these examples so far is in a jungle, cave, island, or some other natural environment. Well, I imagine Primordial Horror would primarily use environments like these, but that does raise a question: what about urban and or industrial ones? I can't 100% rule them out, because we will be talking about REANIMAL later. Albeit I do imagine you would need to get creative if that will be the setting of choice. I mean, there is a Predator movie set within a city after all. I can't remember if that movie was any good, but it still exists. Anyway, like having feral humans or dangerous animals running around a city as part of the setting, it can be done as per the movie I Am Legend, in which Will Smith is playing the main character. That movie is essentially this. The vampire-like feral men who can't go into sunlight even have infected dogs, so it's not impossible to create a primordial, almost inhuman horror in an urban setting. It would just be more common in an outdoor setting. But ultimately, Predator shows you can have guns in Primordial Horror, and to great effect. The fact it managed to do so much damage against them while they have guns shows the power the Predator actually has as an antagonist, which would ultimately make its defeat all the more satisfying. Essentially, you can have modern guns and such in Primordial Horror as long as they don't detract from the core hunter-hunted horror too much. If anything, use them to balance the setting, or make examples of how the antagonizing force works in response. Because, let's be honest, a lot of horror movies just bring a gun and that sort of nullifies the threat, especially if the threat is something physical. But anyway, Primordial Horror does not need to rely on an outdoors environment if you're creative enough with the story. Moving on in a way that completely juxtaposes that, Primal, the animated series by Gendy, I can't pronounce that second name, the creator of Samurai Jack, uses the wild primal setting and leans into showing off the various terrifying violent aspects of it. I would say the iconic Mad Sauropod episode is a prime example. The fact a disease this destructive and violent and fast can just exist in that universe shows there is little limit to what can really happen while ultimately trying to stay within the confines of something fairly natural. Hell, we see all sorts of other insane shit in the setting too that is all fairly natural. Giant primal spiders, primitive human-sized bats, vicious primitive ape men, covens of witches tapping into some sort of ancient earthly magic, nocturnal predators, and fuckloads more. Essentially, Primal stays to its settings, tone, world, and ultimately expands on it instead of pushing it away like Sons of the Forest tried to. It doesn't stay 100% to horror. There's a good amount of action and some things that do step away from the primordial setting somewhat, but it does that in a way where it gives a good contrast to the setting in a unique way, such as the Oxford boxing champion versus the Madman. I'm not sure if that happens in season 1 or 2, so if it's in season 2, sorry for the spoilers I'm about to drop, you can just skip forward. Anyway, ultimately the Oxford boxing champion has to make a spear to kill the Madman, as there's no way to beat him through sheer brute force, as the Madman is just too feral and too strong of an opponent. But ultimately this fight between the two gives us a strong contrast to the primal and civilized world, and shows us that despite how civilized we think we are, the innate nature of humanity is still there. We are always and always will be able to make a solution regardless of how powerful our opponent is. But anyway, in spite of that, we see what kinds of insane shit also lives in this world for better or worse ultimately. And this section covering Primal can essentially be summed up as: leaning into the Primal setting means doing world building, adding creatures, plants, hell, even adding shit that's adjacent and or connected to whatever core antagonist you plan to add, so that you can then build off that to add themes and other such important details. Like the aforementioned biomass Sons of the Forest section. You could have it alternatively spreading out across a landscape and growing into other bizarre primordial stuff, or making new primordial life whatever style you choose for it, but ultimately, all of that needs to connect into whatever central theme it's part of. Anyway, to condense this part further, if you have a primordial setting or any setting at all, do some world building in fitting ways that thematically connect with the setting, whatever antagonist force you have planned if applicable. And with that laid out, we can move on to the next one, and that is Water Womb World. Okay, I'm just gonna be straight, not many people probably know about Water Womb World, but in summary, a diver explores the sea for what he thinks is the Garden of Eden, only for him to discover that humanity stems from not a literal garden like the Bible says, but a giant red primordial coral mass, most likely predating humanity. And on this mass and the seabed around it, proto-humans that lack limbs or eyes are growing from it. But they are immortal and part of this garden being. It also shows us that the fish have been eating parts of the coral and infected by it, making them deathless, albeit they too are affected, losing their eyes and mutating, regressing into simpler, less evolved forms. The game also features angels that take the form of squid-like beings with human faces, albeit in spite of everything the protagonist encounters, ultimately he gets a coral sample, which gives off a implied to be strong psychic field and goes mad due to its effect. He leaves the submarine, takes off his mask, and eats the coral outside, and gets infected by it, and is then assimilated by this supposed god. If the god present in Water Womb World is canonically the actual god, this very much leans into the existential ideas Primordial Horror can play around with if done right. However, does Primordial Horror even need to explore existential horror? No, you can just have a game or story about being hunted by animals, or even feral mad humans if you wish, or whatever creature. It's not necessary, but it does add some nice narrative depth and room for exploring deeper themes, like the nature of human existence and why we behave the way we do. For example, Water Womb World's protagonist is kind of Christian. He views its stories as primitive superstition, but he seeks to understand the root in which it all comes from. He, however, thinks that science and Christianity also complement one another in an unorthodox way, as he seeks to scientifically discover the exact point man fell from grace, the Garden of Eden, which leads him to below the ocean. It feels to me at least he believes in a higher power but seeks to know the true nature of it, hence the exploration. And ultimately we do discover that at the end, albeit it's revealed that the story of Eden was not literal but metaphorical for humanity likely detaching from this coral god mass. Essentially, Water Womb World looks at the story of Eden and says, what if it was metaphorical and the truth was horrific? While simultaneously giving us a man who embraces God as an idea but seeks to know more. And the inherent nature of humanity is fully on display with his actions. He is driven by his curiosity, which is juxtaposed by the twist of God being revealed to be a mass of coral. Not a divine light, not a supreme being, but just a mass of simple coral. What I'm saying here is, we have the nature of man expressed by the protagonist's curiosity, and God shown to us. It's curiosity versus the answer, and ultimately, it just leaves us, the game player, with more questions. Which again, taps into the nature of us as humans. We are curious, we want to know. We as humans inherently just desire to know. Again, leaning even further into the nature of man on a deeper level. To ultimately summarize this section, does Primordial Horror truly need existential themes? While not necessarily, they are great to have and greatly deepen the narrative. It's a superb way to explore the nature of the setting and its characters too, as the nature of the characters could be, by proxy, also attached to the theme as per the aforementioned Water Womb World. Anyway, with that entire section laid out, we'll be moving on to the next game on this list, REANIMAL, which came out really recently as I write this video script. I'm gonna be honest, I really want to do a full-on analysis of this game and what it means. And with the recent revelation of cut dialogue, I suspect that the story was rewritten multiple times, so that's going to influence the end result. Regardless of what the overall meaning of the game is, in regards to how it's attached to Primordial Horror, that's what we're going to talk about. I feel like the monsters are the best example of how it is attached to it. The Sniffer, which resembles a human in an urban environment, undisturbed will carry out human-like activities. However, once it becomes aware of prey, it will switch to more animalistic behavior, and its body will contort and realign itself to move in a more arachnid fashion. This leans more into primordial horror. It's sort of like the cannibal natives from the forest, but in an urban post-war setting, and it acts more like an actual animal in the way it moves, while pretending to be human. There is also the snake-like skin suits that the sniffer has created, which slide around and hunt you like actual snakes, which also adds into that primordial primal fear horror theme. The lamb, the main antagonist, also fits. It's a giant mutated sheep that brings nothing but unrelenting violence. It's either attacking things or eating things. Albeit I feel the lamb monster is a mix of primordial and eldritch horror, given it constantly grows and eventually becomes something akin to the Gravemind from Halo in appearance. It is also implied to either, at least to me, be the wrath of God manifested or a vessel for a primordial being reshaping the world in pure spite. Albeit I genuinely need to sit down, replay REANIMAL again, and further analyze this game for its own dedicated video. But anyway, I feel REANIMAL certainly has aspects of primordial horror, but I wouldn't say it's one definitively. It's primarily eldritch horror. Same would go for ULTRAKILL. While hell has existed long before humanity, and is so powerful that even God fears it, I would call ULTRAKILL a primordial shooter or primordial action, not horror. Even then, I would hesitate to say that ULTRAKILL can really be connected to primordial horror in a meaningful way. Like, you're literally rampaging through the main antagonist as a machine, something that is not connected to a primordial or even organic sense, outside of the biomass that V1 or whatever machines are using to hold blood as a fuel source. But anyway, in this video I was also going to talk about the following: Mystery Flesh Pit National Park, Cave Crawler, Gemini Home Entertainment, and a Russian sleep experiment. But I sat there writing this script and gave it some thinking, and I can honestly just summarize these ones if they fit or not, which I'm going to do now. Mystery Flesh Pit National Park counts. It's a giant fucking superorganism living underground that is home to unique, bizarre, horrifying life. And its existence lore-wise is ancient, primordial, and its body plan is vaguely starfish-like. It's very primitive but very large. Its mere existence poses existential questions on how such a creature could even exist, and the story points out how dangerous this thing would be if it was disturbed or awoke fully. Even some of the creatures that live within it make you question what they could possibly be related to. For example, the abyssal copepod. This thing has literal human-like hands, which ultimately would make you question if it either evolved to copy them, or is related to humanity in some way. As I write this, it's also still going on and is, in my opinion, worth looking at. Does it count as primordial horror? Definitely, albeit in a more abstract megalophobia way, with a bit of existentialism. Next up, Cave Crawler. A drone explores a cave looking for missing people. You find flesh underground and the bodies being ultimately turned into crystals. The game ends with you finding a giant eye and losing the rover. Honestly, this one's pretty flat and lacks much depth. It counts technically as a primordial horror, but it's really just a simple one that makes you ask general questions about what's going on. Gonna keep this one $1.50 with you, Chief. Not a fan of this one, it's kinda boring. It counts, but it's just the shell of a concept, really. Next up, Gemini Home Entertainment. Gonna be honest, it's not really primordial horror, except for a few aspects like deep root disease, the underground aliens, the wood crawlers tunneling into houses, and the cult operating the human sacrifices to the iris. Outside of that, it's primarily eldritch and body horror. And lastly on this list is the Russian sleep experiment creepypasta. Honestly, no, I'm not going to count this one, except in one aspect, and that is the test subject's primal rage and madness emerging due to the gas-based stimulant, making a vague attempt at ultimately questioning the nature of humanity as a whole, but that's all it really has going for it. So no, it barely qualifies. And with that, those are defining examples given. With all of this laid out, now I can define what makes something primordial horror or pushes it in that direction. Firstly, you need a setting that enables primal fear. The fear of being stalked, hunted, watched, etc. This can be done with dimly lit marshlands, woodlands, rural towns, old farms out in nowhere, dark caves, etc. With plenty of places for something to stalk you and hide. Secondly, whatever the antagonist is, it needs to really tap into that. Hungry animal watching in the swamp, insane feral cannibal cultist stalking you while you're lost in the woods, some mad hunter with a gun trying to blast you for wandering out into his territory, fungal primordial god trying to infect your town from below ground, etc. Whatever it is, it should ideally fit within the actual setting, as if it always belonged there and can use that to its advantage. Effectively, the antagonist needs to have the home field advantage. Thirdly, the world building. It should reflect the nature of what's happening. If it's a predator stalking the woods, you can add subtle footprints and dead animals that it's eaten. Or you can add newspaper clippings and buildings that show people have had partial sightings of it. If it's cultists, you can have a camp and shrines, maybe the remains of sacrifices and such. If it's an insane hunter, you could have a hunter's cabin out there somewhere, full of trophies, and there could be traps laying around the woods as well. If it was a fungal primordial god coming up from under the ground, you could have signs of fungal infection growing in places and things it likes, such as basements, caves, tunnels, etc., or on corpses and people if applicable. Fourthly, themes and meanings. This all depends on what it's going for ideas-wise, but the theme for something within Primordial Horror usually taps into something about nature, humanity, existentialism, religion, etc. There are countless ways this can be done. A giant fungal god below the soil pushing themes of existentialism, cultists that make you question the true nature of humanity, etc. Ideally, the themes should also be connected with the setting in some way, the antagonist, the main characters, the story's events, whatever. And fifthly, everything needs to thematically line up or else it's just an incomprehensible mess. Like, if your antagonist is the aforementioned primordial fungal god from below the earth, it would make sense if it had always been there, dormant and waiting. More so if you add lore to imply or state that. However, if you were to suddenly then reveal that it was some alien that crash landed despite the lore that it's a primal earthly god that originates from Earth, it's just going to take away from the idea of it being an ancient primordial force from Earth, and it's going to make no sense due to conflicts. Like how I mentioned with the Forest and Sons of the Forest. Sons of the Forest fails because the first game implies the artifact is entirely from Earth. And that includes both artifacts, the Resurrection and Power Obelisk. Despite these devices very clearly being incredibly advanced, there's no implication that these are alien. If anything, they seem to be an ancient Earth society, not anything alien. But the sequel suddenly tying it all to aliens just makes that conflict. You may even be tempted to say unless you find some workaround, which is partially true. However, it being an alien means it's not from Earth, so the pre-established idea that it was all from Earth is going to conflict with that. And that's just not good writing, period. And with that, that's all 5 laid out. With that all defined and set up, I feel I've set up a decent if not good definition for Primordial Horror. Albeit I do feel like it could be expanded on. However, despite providing the entire list I've gone through in this video, I feel The Forest, the very first game, is the best single current example that I'm aware of at least. It's not the one defining true example, but a good point in the right direction. Which in turn does raise a very important question. What would to me at least be a defining true example of the genre? Well, due to The Forest being the closest example I have, being unaware of anything closer, and not wanting to use the exact same game again, I feel it'd be best if I made up my own concept for one. However, I will unfortunately have to make that into a separate video at some point if I ever get around to it, as to not detract from this too much. Hell, if I have the time and motivation, I may just make my own Primordial Horror film and or story. Won't lie, that would be fun to do at some point. Anyway, in regards to Primordial Horror as a possible genre, I feel it has great potential to fully become one if people explored it more often, and started building on the concept in new exciting ways. However, for now at least, it's just taking root and there's plenty of growing to do. I really want to see this concept develop more and see where it can go. But for now, all I can do is wait, and just maybe plant some of those spores myself, and see where their roots take me. Discover how far down the roots can really go. But until then, if you know anything that could also feed into this genre, please comment below and tell me about it, I'm curious. Who knows, maybe I missed something obvious. Also, I hope you enjoyed this dive into what I felt was an interesting potential genre, and I hope maybe you will feel inspired to expand upon it yourself if need be. Sorry if my voice sounded weird in this video, I got this weird pain in my lower throat that I'm not entirely sure what's causing it, my throat just feels dry. But anyway, unfortunately, that brings me to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this, subscribe, bell, like, share it if you can. Discord, or alternatively my Steam group, will be linked in the description, just in case Discord shits the bed given the state of it these days. Anyway, see you around. Good night.